I had these jobs that were we don't really know what we're doing. We're kind of making it up as we go. And that was super exciting.
I don't daydream, I just do dreams. Built to fire, no camping. Imagine your next chapter for uncommon paths. It's the roadmap. With special guests you can learn from, more valuable than a treasure chest. Unlocking knowledge, catch fire, turn impossible to a playground. Difficulties we do them in like a pool table, got holes for 'em. Inspiration, catch fire, find your passion and live for it. Start bold, it gets harder, dig further. Inspiration, catch fire, find your passion and live for it.
Well, Beth, thanks for joining us today. I've been excited for this interview.
Thanks, Simon. I'm really excited. I feel like it's been ages since I saw you, so it's really fun to see you.
Yeah. So maybe we could start at where you find yourself today, and then we could kind of rewind a little bit as appropriate.
That sounds like a good place to start. So we are in this weird place of quarantine, so everything feels a little bit different. But I am. So I'll talk about kind of the two sides of things. I find myself professionally working as an engineering manager for a company called CallRail. And so CallRail is a company that is Atlanta based, which is where I live. And I had heard about as when I started getting into software development. So I knew about it. It was always kind of in Atlanta technical so forth. And I knew who worked there, and when I'm trying to think what year it was. One time there was a program that was happening in Atlanta that was it was a fundraiser for nonprofits. And so CallRail decided that they were going to sponsor Women Who Code. And so I found myself at CallRail talking about Women Who Code. And then fast forward about 4 years later, now I work there. So that was kind of cool foreshadowing for me. But I work as an engineering manager, and I work with a couple of different teams, and it's really exciting. It's a company that was started by mostly engineers, and so there's definitely an appreciation of engineering and an understanding of that. But it's a great company, and so that's a lot of fun, and challenges, but a lot of fun. And on the other side, I am one of the three co-directors for Women Who Code Atlanta. So Women Who Code is a global organization, and then there are chapters, or what we call networks. And so the Atlanta network has been around since I joined in 2015, and I kind of joined by accident. I was going to a conference and had found out that Sandy Metz was speaking at this event. Super excited to, I had never heard of Women Who Code, but I had heard of Sandy Metz. So I went to this event, and I happened to meet kind of the organizer and the founder of the network, Erica Stanley. And so I started coming to meetings and so forth. And then after a while, I was like, hey, I think I'd like to do something. And there was a pretty quick path to becoming one of the co-directors. And so I've been doing that since about 2017. And then we also have a conference that we started separate from Women Who Code, but also it's run by the same three people who happen to be the directors for Women Who Code Atlanta. And so sometimes there's a little overlap, but we have a conference called Refactor.tech, which we started in 2019, and we had an awesome lineup for 2020, and we ended up postponing it.
That's sad.
Yes, it really, it was so sad. I mean, we had just started like booking travel and all the things that you do, and then it just like, I feel like in March when we started going into quarantine, we were like, a couple of months.
Yes.
And I don't think anybody expected it would be this duration.
Nope. Well, shout out to the conference. I think that's one thing. I don't know a lot of people that know you, but from everything I've heard about your world, it's like, oh, these conferences that Beth helps run. Like, you have some good street cred. So someday I want to get down for one and check it out. So
we are hopeful that we're going to be able to do something in 2021, and so we're sort of putting together some contingency plans and some, if this happens, here's what we'll do. If that happens, here's what we're going to do. So, but we're determined to do something in 2021 because it's just been too long.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And when I come to the conference, I will make sure that you're aware of what I think about the internet quality at the. I'm just joking. I'm just like, why is that always the
Oh,
only thing that people complain about? It's like you could do everything right, and
I, I will say
so
that we are really lucky in that we had a conference that we started before that. So we ran that for 2 years, and then we started doing Refactor.tech. And we are doing it at the same place, which is the Loudermilk Center in Atlanta. And the food is really good. So that's the other complaint that you
yes.
always hear about conferences is the food. The food's really good. So you can complain about the internet. That might be true. We've worked on it, so it's better, but
Oh man, and I'm not saying just that venue
yeah,
specifically, but I mean it's just Drupal. I went
always.
to DrupalCon a few times, and that was always I was just like, man, this is there's a lot of other good stuff going on.
That's very
Okay,
true.
so I mean I couldn't help but notice in your intro. It seems like all of these women that code and stuff kind of are the themes. So I just am curious, as you've come up through the ranks, so to speak, or progressed in your career, have you been one of the few women you've known that have been in engineering, or what has the cohort been like around you?
So that's a good question. Despite my age, my tenure in my technology career is not huge. It's not very long. So I have had this is my second job. And so in my first job, I would say that there were some women around, but mostly men. And I would say that that's true where I am now. Um, it's definitely more men than women. But it's something that I think there's been a lot of inroads made on. Obviously, Women Who Code, we primarily have women who come to our events, and we are open to everybody. So it's not that we don't allow men. We almost always have one or two men who come. Back when we had physical events. And now that we're doing virtual events, we typically, if we have a speaker, we typically have one or two men who show up, but
Cool.
it is predominantly women. So.
And so when you all talk about the impact that you hope women that code makes, how do you articulate that? What's your hope or vision for that?
Yeah, so Women Who Code globally, our mission is to help women advance their careers in technology. And so it's interesting. So when I started, sorry, there's a
You're
train
good.
in the background. When I started, we were doing a lot of things, and there's a misconception that people have when they hear Women Who Code, and that they think that it's all women who are starting out, that are all in at the beginner phase of their career, and that is true sometimes, but it's certainly not always true. And so I would say that we have about, I don't know, going on, we have somewhere upwards of 4,000 people in our Atlanta network. And of them, we have people who are architects, and we have people who have started companies, and we have people who are very, very senior engineers. And then we have a lot of people who are starting out. So it definitely runs the gamut. But I think that that's a misconception that people sometimes have when they see Women Who Code and they conflate it with Girls Who Code. So that is sometimes a little bit weird, but we have had so typically before time when we had in-person events, we would have 3 events per month in a typical, unless we did extra things, of course, but in a typical month, we would have one big event that was having a speaker or a panel. And so it would be about, let's all get together in a physical location. We usually had a nice dinner and some wine, and we would have somebody who would talk about a topic, or we would have a panel of people talking about something. We also would have a what we call code jam, and that was a come together and here's some time for you to put in your calendar, and we're going to spend time. You could sit there and work independently on a project that you have, but this is your time to do that. Or you could come and say, oh, I need help with this. Is there anybody who knows about setting up Node? Is there anybody who knows about Python? Or you could come and maybe find somebody who is also learning with you and just pair up. So that was a great thing. And sometimes we would have 5 people, and sometimes we would have 35 or 40 people. It just was, it varied a lot. And the third event that we typically had is a lunch. And so we would meet at a local place that has a lot of restaurants where you can go buy your food and then you come sit at a table. And that's purely social. Obviously, nobody is whipping out their laptop while we're sitting there, but it was a great way for people to network and get to know each other. So in this time, when we're no longer meeting in person, we have started doing virtual events. And so we've started doing some so we'll have a speaker. We did a Hacktoberfest. We did a big kickoff for that, and then we did a kind of a midway point where it was kind of a Hacktoberfest co-jam where we invited people to come, but we had invited some experts. So we had people in Python, we had maintainers, we had people who could help people. And so we were going to kind of put people into rooms if they needed kind of one-on-one coaching. It ended up being just people asking questions in a big group, but that was great. So people could say like, I don't know where to even start. And then we had a couple of people who had suggestions. We paired that up with a channel in our Slack so that people could follow up. And we're actually doing virtual lunches now. And at first I was a little bit hesitant. I was like, it just doesn't really capture the whole idea of like, you're going and getting food from your favorite restaurant. You're going to come sit down. You don't know, but it's been really good. And people seem to really, really appreciate it. So we're trying to, one of the nicest things about Women Who Code Atlanta is it's just a really nice group of people. I mean, I've had people comment on that. When people come to CodeJam, we've had a lot of people who are either starting or about to start a boot camp. And there are always people who are like, oh, let me sit down with you and walk you through this. I've sat down with people, I'm
That's
like,
huge.
I don't know what this is, but I'm going to sit down and we're going to go through it together. And, you know, sometimes it's just another pair of eyes seeing the error message that you didn't see, and sometimes it's just people are afraid. So it is a very nice group, and so I feel like that has translated into the virtual lunch.
I just can't imagine too, like putting myself in the shoes of somebody that's going through a boot camp who might even be making a career change or something like that, but meeting folks that are managers or have started their own company. I mean, that are helping them with these get started. How much that must hopefully demystify or kind of just bring everything more down to earth. That sounds pretty cool. So
It was at our last virtual lunch. There's a woman came who I think it was her first time coming to an event, but it turns out that she's a recruiter for a local company. And not only did she talk about some of the positions that she had open, but she offered for anybody, especially coming out of school or a boot camp, that she would be happy to meet with them and go through their resume and help them just figure out how to do it. And I was like, thank you so much. That's exactly what people need. So many people, especially when they're career switchers, feel, and if they go to a boot camp or something, feel like all they have is this boot camp experience and they have to expunge everything else off of their resume. And that's just, it's not true at all. And so we talked about that a lot, and so she put that, I said, would you put that in the Slack channel? And so she did. And it's just, people are just so willing to help.
that's cool. Recruiters are definitely these experts now. I don't know if they probably don't want to do any more of what they already do all day. But I feel like if they wanted to do a side hustle of like giving people hot takes on their resume and stuff like that, I mean, those folks just see the gamut. They see everything. So,
And they know the language that resonates and they know how to make it short and concise and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, so I thought, I mean, she brought that up. She was very, it was definitely in her mind when she was coming, and that was fantastic. So we've been fortunate. We've had programs where we had panels that talked about getting your first. So I will admit that some of our panels have been very self-serving because there are things that I've been wondering, like how do you get your first job in tech? And then how do you, what are people looking for? So I've channeled that into creating a panel, and that's been really good. So typically in January, we have a panel that has to do with career related stuff. And so we typically, well, have a sort of when we're in person, we've had some recruiters come and just kind of set up a table and people could go and ask them for help, bring their resume, pull up their LinkedIn, whatever. And that's been super effective.
cool. It's almost, I wonder if it'd be a boon for the boot camps too, like selecting folks that are in your network. I mean, I'm not saying there's like a position or a privilege, but just that they have that support system. That's, so as a guy, how can I be an ally? Like putting myself in the shoes of I guess maybe people in Atlanta, or we have groups like this in St. Louis too. What does it look like for me to cheerlead, champion, you know, do anything else but take the spotlight, support in any way possible?
I mean, I've been going through a lot of this thinking myself because one of the I think one of the coolest things about the Atlanta Women Who Code Network is that we have a good amount of diversity, and it's probably no accident that of our three co-founders, two of them are Black women, and I think that helps. I think it's really important for people to be able to see themselves, and so I feel like I can empathize a lot because I'm going through this in terms of how can I support people of color, Black people, and make sure that I'm not taking the spotlight. So I've been trying to, if people are talking about diversity and inclusion, I'm not the best person to be there talking about that. There are people much better suited than me to do that. So I've been trying to make sure that people who are better able to represent that are in the spotlight. I think that I was reading a lot about this recently about the fact that it's not enough at your company to be a mentor, but to be a sponsor. And in my mind, I'll be honest, these topics were like, well, what does that mean exactly? But I think the whole idea, what made it really clear to me is as a sponsor, you actually are advocating for somebody. So it's not enough to say, hey, let me help you with this. It's about representing or helping pave the way for somebody when they're not in the room. And I think that's huge.
That is huge. Yeah. What
Um,
talk about just like from an organizational perspective? I mean, obviously you're familiar with your organization, but you have a lot of tech companies that are hiring junior people, and hopefully it's not to check a diversity box. But what do you feel like the responsibility of any organization is to grow those folks and people that will bring diversity in all ranks?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's something that there's no quick and easy thing that you can do. There's to check that box off. It's something that has to be incorporated into everything. And actually, at my company right now on the engineering side, a small group of us are actually looking at our interviewing process and making sure that it's as effective as it needs to be. And part of that is how are we making sure that we are we have a process that works for everybody and that we're not one of the things we talked about, for example, is how do you make sure that you're giving understanding from a technical standpoint what somebody's ability is without making it this 8-hour thing, right? And so we had conversations about are if you make something super long, then you're making it very hard for somebody who has a job and has a family. And so who are you cutting out of the process? I'm not saying we've arrived at the right answer yet because we're still discussing it. But I think it's really important to start looking at these things and really looking at them from every aspect of, oh, if this is our process, who are we making it uncomfortable for? So I think you have to start from there, right? Because if you're not getting people in the door, then
Yeah.
you're not even starting. But how do you make sure that people really have a chance to get to know the organization, feel like their voice is being heard, their concerns are being heard, and things like that?
Yeah. I don't know. It struck me. I'm not mincing words, but just you mentioned the uncomfortability, and I think there's also the element too of like good uncomfort and bad uncomfort or discomfort, because it's like if you take like being on a stage as an analogy, like if you're just like, oh, I'm gonna take all the audience out of the room, so you're not uncomfortable, like that's demeaning, that's not empowering. And so
Yes.
I think that's just a great spirit that y'all have, and I commend you all for doing that because I think that's going to make a huge difference.
Thank
So,
you. I mean, I think you're absolutely right because if you don't, it's kind of like I know somebody had a job that they were looking for somebody, and I have to admit, like I caught myself, fortunately, but I thought about somebody and then I was like, oh, you know what? She's pregnant. So she's not going to want this. And then I was like, well, that's not my place to decide that. That's her place to decide that, right? And I think that's a really good example of don't assume what somebody does or doesn't want. And I think that happens
yeah,
sometimes. Yeah.
almost like unintentionally gatekeeping towards stereotypes or something. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm gonna be thinking about this all day now. Thanks, Beth. Jeez. I'm just joking. Okay, so this is all super interesting, but just to kind of keep the what I build the show as in mind. This is another thing my wife has been challenging me on. It's like, you say that this is what the show's about, so you better talk about this stuff. I'm like, touche. So, but anyway, you mentioned that you didn't always work in tech. Would you be able to kind of tell us a little bit of the backstory?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's I don't think it's that unique, but it's my story. So I actually started my career. So I grew up in Atlanta. I'm an Atlanta native, and I went to Georgia State University. And while I was there, I started working part time for this company that actually had a joint venture. And this was a long, long time ago. And one of the customers of this product was Access Atlanta. So Access Atlanta was one of the first online newspapers in the United States. And so I ended up getting a job there. And literally as I finished school, I fell into this job. And so I was the video text manager. So not many people are going to know what the heck that means, but that's okay. That was the title then. And basically it was a glorified bulletin board system. We put up some of the newspaper, and then we started putting up more of it. We started putting up the classifieds and things like that. So that was my first career. So it was all about online newspapers. So I worked at several different newspapers in the online area. So I worked at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, I worked at the San Jose Mercury News, and I worked at the St. Paul Pioneer Press. And in between there, I did a stint at an internet startup that went through an IPO, and that was in Philadelphia, a company called Infonautics. So I kind of had these jobs that were very much we don't really know what we're doing. We're kind of making it up as we go. And that was super exciting. We didn't really know what we were doing when we started Access Atlanta. And then moving into San Jose, I was the first managing producer, which was a brand new role. So had to figure out what that meant. So I did a lot of kind of figuring things out. And that was super exciting. And then when we were in St. Paul, so I went from San Jose, which was a Night Ritter paper, to St. Paul, Minnesota, which nobody could believe. They were like, "What? You're moving from California to Minnesota? What are you thinking?" But Minnesota is really a great place. And so while we were there, we had a couple of kids, and at the same time, there were a lot of changes happening in the newspaper industry and specifically to Night Ritter. And I decided that we were going to move back to Atlanta. And so I left my job and we moved back to Atlanta, which is where I'm from. And I have a lot of family, and having young kids, it just seemed like the right thing to do. And fortunately, my husband was a good partner and went along with that. So when we moved here, I ended up through a old coworker of mine, finding out about this position that was a part-time position remotely working with a nonprofit. And so I ended up with this 6-month contract that lasted for 9 years. And so it was working. So this is career 2. So I worked for this nonprofit that was all about the intersection of news, society, and technology. And so it went through a couple of different permutations, but ended up as something called We Media. Same people, just a different company. So it started as New Directions for News, and then became part of the American Press Institute, and then spun off out of there and became We Media. And so that was a lot of fun. And I got to learn a lot about entrepreneurship and figuring out how do you fit into different conversations. And we had this awesome conference that we ran in Miami. I mean, there's no better place to be than Miami in February. So that was really fun too. And I got to meet some really cool people. So after a while, my kids were getting older, and part-time it just wasn't as much of a career anymore. And so I decided to go to boot camp. And so I ended up going to what was then called WDI, Web Development Immersive Boot Camp at General Assembly, and finished that in 2015. So after I finished my boot camp, I had what I'll call family debt that I had to pay off. And so that is all the people who helped with my kids and my family when I was in this boot camp. So it took me a while to kind of clear the decks and then start looking for work. But I ended up getting a job at CNN, which was my first interview. So of course I wasn't going to get that job, but it's the only interview I went on. And so I ended up starting there as a QA analyst. And then after a year, moving into a position as a software developer on the same team. And that was awesome. So I stayed there for about 3.5 years and then decided that I really wanted to take my management experience and my software development experience and combine them. And so I decided that I was going to look for a job as an engineering manager. And that is where I am today.
Yeah. Just for people listening that have never heard of a coding boot camp, really quick, could you just give us a little snippet of what your experience was at a coding boot camp?
Absolutely. So I have to say, I was in cohort 2. So it probably has changed quite a bit since then. But so I had always been tech adjacent, and honestly, I still remember like some basic 10 Unix commands from when I had to reinstall Unix. So I've always kind of dove into technology as needed, but I never had a comprehensive view of things. And so the idea of the boot camp is in a short amount of time, roughly 3 months. Some are a little bit longer, some are a little bit shorter. You go through a very intense program. I went through a full-time one. There are part-time ones, but the full-time one is basically a full-time job of learning software development. And then after hours, you work on your projects. So it's like a 10-hour a day for about 3 months. And when I did it, we learned Ruby on Rails. And then we learned, we started with some HTML and CSS, of course, but learned Ruby on Rails, and we also learned Angular back when it was Angular 1. So that's changed a lot. I think one of the interesting things about a lot of these boot camps is they will look at the city that they're in, and they will try to get a good sense of what technology jobs are in demand, and kind of like they've now, General Assembly, at least in Atlanta, has moved more to React and Vue.
Yeah, and having some of those technologies that employers are looking for potentially.
Right.
Oh,
And so, and a node backend and things like that. But it
yeah.
yeah, when I thought about trying to just learn myself, and I actually went to a Rails Bridge, which is a 1 day thing that's put on, that was great. And it was kind of my like test of like, can I do this? And what I learned is, yes, I could do this, but I was very fortunate in that I was able to make the financial decision to go to a boot camp. It's not everybody can do that. There are certainly some opportunities for, scholarships and discounts and things like that. But for me, I needed the accountability, and I wanted there to be somebody that I could turn to when I got stuck and say, what's happening now? And
Hmm.
I was lucky that I had the opportunity to do that. Not everybody does. I think it's harder if it's your own journey, but it's definitely possible. So I think it's really important to know that a boot camp is not the only way to get there.
Yeah. We've been really fortunate too in St. Louis. We have a thing called Launch Code that was founded, and that it's basically like the companies that hire out of that help pay for it. So
Oh,
there's no upfront cost to the students, and then that they have like a kind of a division of that called Coder Girls too. It's just specifically focused on being a magnet for women. So
that's
that's been a
awesome.
huge resource to St. Louis, and I think they're in Florida now too. But Jim McKelvey started it, who's one of the Square co-founders, and I forget if he moved to Florida, and they anyway, but they're for sure in St. Louis, as I confuse everybody. So,
That's
um,
cool.
okay, so you did this, you did the boot camp, which I think is really cool. You made a pivot, but you mentioned something earlier, and that is that from a resume perspective, when people are pivoting into tech, they don't necessarily have to throw out everything on their resume, which I completely agree with. But talk about that from your perspective. Like when you were going through this, some people might hear the career pivot and think, oh, now Beth is a totally different person. But it sounds like you were following some kind of North Star through this. Talk about what that might have been.
So I mean, I am a big believer in whatever experience you had before is helpful. And it could be, so for me, I had from a pretty young point in my career, been a manager. So part of that was managing people. Part of it was figuring out what do you need to do. Part of it was managing the budget, which was everything was a learning opportunity for sure. And so there were aspects of that that I missed, even when I was in the nonprofit space. While I wasn't managing people, um, I I was figuring out how to get things done. And so taking that and helping to pull that through on my resume was important. And being able, I mean, to be honest, like I feel like being a parent is one of the best training grounds for being a good manager, although I don't advocate people having children to become better managers.
Yeah, for sure. You end up learning how to work with terrorists a little bit better too when you have toddlers. So
So true.
when people used to joke about this, I was like, "You're kind of being mean to your toddler." And then I learned, I mean, you love them to death, but they don't. There's no downside, or like they have nothing to lose. So it's just
Nothing.
like,
That is so true. I mean, and also it make like that the whole mentality of like everything is right now. There is no later. There is no yesterday. It's all right now.
it's a good
And
point.
yeah, so, but yeah, I do feel like it helps you, in so many ways. Part of it is like like I think one of the biggest tricks about having teenagers, I don't know if how you feel about this, is understanding that you are now on their schedule. They are not on your schedule. Meaning when they want to talk to you is when you're going to talk to them. And trying to have them conform to talk to you when it's convenient for you is a losing game.
Okay, that's
And
yeah. I'm just thinking about yeah. Uh, do you, from that perspective, how do you feel like the relationships with your kids have played out since they've left home?
well, it's not all gone yet. But it's funny because when I started, after I finished boot camp, I was invited to be on a panel. I think it was at the boot camp I went to, General Assembly, and it was about like time management or life balance or something like that. I mean, I just can't remember exactly what it was called, but I remember going to it and then literally saying, I have to leave now because I have to drop my daughter off at the, like, that's how life works. And so I have often brought my children to events. They have often volunteered at events. And I think it's important, like, that they see what I'm doing and have an opportunity to be part of it. And so, which isn't to say that I don't take time off to go to their things too. I do. But I think like them seeing that full picture is really helpful.
Brilliant. Okay. So, kind of two more things we try to hear from everybody on is for folks starting out. If you could give them some advice or even speak to fears that they might be having, how would you encourage folks that are just starting out, either from school or in tech?
So it's funny. At that same conference where we met, there was a keynote speaker. And one of the things that he talked about was what is the difference between a senior developer and a mid-level developer? And the answer to that is a senior will ask questions. And I have never forgotten that. I've repeated it many, many times. And I think it's really true. I think that there's a balance. So when you're starting out, I think that it's very natural not to be super confident. But I think it's important to ask questions because it's the only way that you learn. So that being said, I think there's kind of a guide to that. So you're starting out, you don't really know anything. You just started a new job. So of course, there's going to be a process where people are bringing you up to speed and stuff like that. I think it's really important to have a way of capturing your questions so that you're not interrupting constantly with questions, but that you're kind of putting them in context. Because if somebody has a spiel that they're going to go through, you kind of want to let them go through it. They might answer some of your questions. So that's one approach to it, right? Um, it's important that you not ask the same question over and over again. So you should definitely write down the answer to that. If you're unclear, then when you have to ask that question again, it should be in the context of, I'm doing this thing, I did this and this and this. Here's what's happening. I'm not sure. How do I get it to do this other thing? So that you're showing that you have put the work in, and you're not just saying, "Oh, I don't know what I'm doing," and going to somebody else to solve it for you. So I think those things are really important. Um, but back to like when you're first starting out, I kind of started in the middle there. When you're first starting out, I think and this is something that we talk about a lot in Women Who Code, and we talk about a lot at refactor.tech, and that is develop your network and use it. And by that, if you are applying for a job, before you turn that application in, go onto your network, your Slack channel, the people that you know. Ask if anybody works there. Ask if anybody knows anybody who works there. Number one, you might get a referral. Number two, you have somebody you can ask questions of. And number three, you're going to find out, you have a chance to find out if this is a place you want to work. I think the interview process is as much about you learning about that place as them learning about you, and people should take it and use it that way. I think there's nothing worse than people ending up in a place that they don't want to be.
Yeah. And
I
that's
mean, there are worse things, but
yeah, but that's even a skill, is like, just, I mean, you go from worrying about if anybody's going to even offer you a job to trying to figure out if that's a place you want to be. And yeah, it's a big learning curve. I even was thinking too, when you were talking about the asking questions part, I remember how shocked I was when I was going through a process like that, and these senior folks were able to critique stuff that I spent 40 or more hours on in a matter of like 5 minutes, and kind of send me off on a path to spend 40 more hours or something. And I just remember at first just being completely taken back that it was 5 minutes. Like,
and they probably have that pattern recognition, and that, yeah.
yeah. And so I think that's one of the things I would just not to correct anything you said, but just to add on is like, when you get these answers and it is shockingly clear and concise, like,
Yeah.
just be that doesn't reflect on you. Like it's not like it should have been obvious to you. But maybe expect that it's not going to be a 40-minute explanation. It might be.
That's a really good point. And I think that part of that too is remembering that they were there once too. And that just because it only took them 5 minutes doesn't mean that they don't respect the effort that you put in.
Yes.
So, but I think, it certainly can be a little bit of a shock.
Yeah. And then what are you reading, listening to, viewing, anything that is helping you?
Oh, that's such a good question. I was being really good at listening to a bunch of podcasts for a while, and then I stopped going for my walks, and so I've been really bad at it because I don't have my commute anymore, which is when I used to listen to all my podcasts. So I've been really bad, but I just got a book that I haven't read, but it came highly recommended, called Crucial Conversations. Have you read it?
I've done part of the Audible version, but yes. Is
Is
that
it
I'm trying
good?
to think of the author. I think I heard him speak at a conference, and then I listened to part of the book. Name still Joseph. Is it Joseph Grenny? Maybe, or
It
Joseph?
sounds familiar.
Something.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
yeah. So those are. Yeah, I grew up in a very watching adults be very passive to each other and kind of passive aggressive, and so it was helpful for me to start to learn from folks that were gonna kindly, like, that, where clarity was kindness, and it's taken me, I think, longer than I would have liked to learn that, but I'm grateful that I have some good examples to follow. So
Yeah. That, I guess that I would say that that's a follow on to Radical Candor.
yes,
So for me. I mean, so yeah, so it's kind of in the same vein. I don't know. Have you read
Yes,
Radical Candor? Okay.
that's good stuff.
Yeah.
That's like one of the books the company I work for gives everybody when they join
Oh,
is Radical, and we have like the graph, the four quadrants on the conference room walls and stuff like that. So
oh, nice. Nice.
yeah,
That's great to have that sort of common base and common expectation. And I think that y'all probably do a really good job of making sure that people know the difference between being a jerk and being candid.
we try, but it's hard.
Yeah, I'm
So,
sure.
but it's also humbling when people call you out. Like, I think you need to give me some hard feedback, and I'm kind of like, oh, are you talking to somebody behind me? Like me?
I mean,
Okay.
I think it's one of the hardest things. My company right now is going through some hard conversations, and there's definitely an appreciation on the part of a lot of people that this is being talked about and not being kind of talked about in back rooms or swept under the rug or things like that. And I look at that and I am very thankful that this is that there's an appreciation and acceptance and an encouragement to discuss things and not to just kind of shrug your shoulders and you know think that's just the way it is and I can't do anything to change it.
Yeah, and Brene Brown, I don't know. I think it's a little bit different, but she uses the idea of rumbling too. And I think that that's been so encouraging to me because I've been in some startups like you mentioned you were, and just been around these really strong personalities that are the leader, and been around situations where that rumbling wasn't encouraged. And so for me, it's just as she's kind of started this movement, but then obviously can't do it alone. And excuse me. So just as she's encouraging people around her to like engage in conversations that are more than just telling her that she's awesome, I think that's pretty cool.
It's so funny that you say that. So Brene Brown has a talk that's on it's on Netflix. It's one of her talks in Austin, right? It's great. It's fabulous. And so I love Brene Brown. I think she does such a great job of explaining things. And so so my husband and I watched it. And so now everything that happens is like they just need to watch Brene Brown and understand this. And they so it's very funny. And then trying to explain kind of the whole swimming thing to people like but it's true. It's this whole idea of you are sort of overlaying your story on what somebody else is saying. And that's not what they mean. And you need to just stop and hear what they're really saying.
Yeah. And then, I mean, we should not talk about politics, but of all the things that happen on social media, the two things that drive me most nuts in chronological order was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was this big thing of like, people were saying that hops were ruining craft beer. And I almost wanted to throw my laptop out the window. I was like, what? Where were we before hops? We were a Bud Light. So like, let's just like, you don't have to like hops, but I think they're okay. And then the other thing is like people that are like in this post Brene Brown, like, oh, I just can't do Brene Brown anymore. It's like, well, let's think about where we were before Brene Brown. Like, you don't have to love her, but it's like, I think we're better when these people are bringing, these thoughts to us. So,
And yeah, I think that's this whole idea. I mean, I grew up in the South, right? And so there's definitely this whole like nice thing, right? Where, and it's funny because my mother is actually from New York, and so we didn't grow up with a lot of Southern. Like I didn't grow up having to call people ma'am and things like that. I had to compromise with my seventh grade teacher, and I called her Mrs. Flanders. So I did not grow up with the typical Southern, but it definitely seeped in. And so I find myself even like with the pandemic when it started and I would see somebody and they would like want to give me a hug. And I was like, initially I was like too polite to not. And now I'm like, okay, got to have some boundaries, right? So I think there's definitely some overlay of not wanting to raise things because it's seen as being rude when in actuality, when you care enough to raise something, it really signifies that you care enough. And I think if people kind of mentally did that shift where if you're bringing this up, it's because you care enough about me to bring it up, then you appreciate it. It's much easier to appreciate it.
cool. Well, Beth, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been super fun. It's been great to see you again, but I can't wait to share this with everybody else. So
Simon, thank you so much. This was really fun. It was great to talk to you. It was great to see you and catch up a little bit. I really appreciate it. I love what you're doing. And I wish I could come visit St. Louis
well, do some post pandemic. Let's
sometime.
see some. Okay.